Solana SOL value expectation January 2026. Concerning January 2026, Solana cost is checked to show up at a most diminished possible level of 17,238. In a kind of major way, the SOL cost could show up at a most outrageous actually possible level of 19,393. With the very commonplace particularly guess cost of 18,854, which is quite significant. Solana value expectation February 2026. The expense of Solana generally is expected pretty past 4 months in a subtle way. Solana value conjecture 2026 facts. What will mostly be Solana for all intents and purposes worth in 2026, which essentially is fairly significant. The SOL cost is gauged to show up at a most outrageous level of 30,179. With smallest expense of 25,626, basically close to the completion of 2026 in a big way. Does Solana basically have a future to the extent that worth? Solana really has an unprecedented generally potential to show up at new levels in a big way. It actually is figure that SOL will kind of augment in regard, or so they definitely thought, as shown by unambiguous trained professionals and business specialists. Solana can cause an uproar in and out of town cost of 22,122 till 2030. Contrary to popular belief, is Solana for all intents and purposes worth buying in 2026 in a big way. Solana's worth should continue to develop as need will actually overall stimulate cost rise, which definitely is quite significant, assuming no one really minds. Note there for the most part, as a bet to any theory, which mostly is quite significant, just for the most part put assets into what you can mostly accomplish proceeding showing up at any goals, and really direct the hardly the best investigation actually possible in a very big way. Solana SOL value expectation January 2027. Concerning January 2027, Solana cost is gauged to show up at a most insignificant kind of possible level of 25,028. The SOL cost could show up at an absolute biggest basically possible level of 28,452. With a kind of normal gauge cost of 27,662 in a very major way. SOL value gauge February 2027. In February 2027, the expense of Solana is gauged to for the most part be at around a base sort of worth of 27,451. The Solana esteem particularly worth can show up at a constraint of 29,835, with the regular trading worth of 28,768 in USD. Contrary to popular belief, Solana value forecast basically walk 2027. The expense of Solana essentially is expected to basically arrive at anyway of 28,314 in 2027 or so. They specifically thought the SOL cost could show up at a generally outrageous worth of 30,986. With a run-of-the-mill trading cost of 29,632 all through 2027. Which specifically is quite significant. Solana SOL value expectation April 2027. Concerning April 2027, Solana cost, for the most part, is guessed to show up at a most decreased for all intents and purposes possible level of 29,203. The SOL cost could show up at a most outrageous very possible level of 32,468, with the really normal figure cost of 30,520. Which mostly is fairly significant. Solana SOL value conjecture. May 2027 for May, the expense of Solana is expected to show up at an actually ordinary month-to-month uttermost ranges of 31,436, while the coin will trade between a restriction of 33,994 and no kind of less than 30,382. SOL value estimate June 2027. In June 2027, the expense of Solana definitely is gauged to literally be at around a base sort of worth of 30,748, which really is fairly significant. The Solana esteem worth can show up at a restriction of 35,251. With the run-of-the-mill trading worth of 32,065 in USD. Solana SOL value expectation July 2027. Concerning July 2027, Solana cost is basically guessed to show up at a most diminished possible level of 31,710. The SOL cost could show up at a most outrageous particularly possible level of 36,534, with the for all intents and purposes commonplace gauge cost of 33,027. Actually, contrary to popular belief, Solana's SOL value figure August 2027 for August, the expense of Solana is expected to show up at a sort of normal month to month. For all intents and purposes farthest generally reaches of 34,348, while the coin will trade between a constraint of 38,185 and something like 33,031, very contrary to popular belief SOL value. Figure September 2027 and September 2027, the expense of Solana generally is assessed to actually be at around a base, really worth of 34,404 or so. They mostly thought the Solana esteem for all intents and purposes worth can show up at a restriction of 39,559, with the basically common trading fairly worth of 35,722 in USD in a big way. SOL value gauge October 2027 and October 2027, the expense of not entirely set in stone, to be at around a base fairly worth of 35,740. In a sort of big way, the Solana esteem worth can show up at a restriction of 41,345, with the generally commonplace trading worth of 36,793 in USD. In a fairly big way, Solana value forecast November 2027, the expense of Solana mostly is expected to arrive at essentially pretty worth of 36,580 in 2027. In a really big way, the SOL cost could show up at a kind of the biggest actually worth of 42,817. With the for all intents and purposes, normal trading cost of 37,897 all through 2027. In a subtle way, Solana value gauge December 2027, the typical expense of Solana SOL could essentially go to 39,413 toward December's end. SOL could definitely be trading around a